This video is going to talk about trig inverses and how to find the trig inverse, basically. So this first part I'm going to discuss is a trig. In order to be an inverse, it has to be a one-to-one function, which means that every x has one y. So with here, I showed you the sine, cosine, and tangent curves. And if you remember correctly, if you do the horizontal line test, it doesn't work. It's not one-to-one for all three of these trig functions. So the fact that the horizontal line test doesn't work means it's not one-to-one. So what we do in the trig functions is we pick a spot where it is one-to-one, and that's the only interval area we need to worry about. So for sine, it was determined that from negative 90 up to 90 is one-to-one. If you kept going with that, as soon as you turn that corner and go down here, bam, it's no longer one-to-one. It's in the same thing. If I go down here, this is all one-to-one. But if I turn up, bam, it's no longer one-to-one. So they determined that from negative 90 to 90 is the only interval we have to worry about. So if you think about it in terms of the coordinate plane, for sine, we're worried about these two intervals, or those two quadrants, not the intervals. So that's what we're going to worry about with sine. With cosine, it's a little different, because if you look at cosine, and if you use the same spots, if you use negative 90, which is here, to 90 here, if we were to use that spot, right, if we use this area here, that's clearly not one-to-one because of right here and right here. Okay, so for cosine, we don't use the same spots or the same intervals. So for cosine, we are going to use the spot from 0 to 180. So if you use from 0 to 180, okay, that is one-to-one. If you kept going around the corner and looped around and went past 0 in the negative side, bam, right here you'd all of a sudden stop being one-to-one. If I go down here, so all that's good, this little section is good, and I start turning, then I would suddenly not be one-to-one again. So that's the area they use. So for cosine, it's 0 to 180, or if you think of it as the quadrants, it's these top two. Okay, so for sine, I'm sorry, we said was negative 90 to 90. Okay, so for cosine, I'm sorry, that was cosine. Now tangent, again, I'm looking at tangent, and if I use from 0 to 180, 0 to 180, okay, so from 0 to 180, that actually works. They end up picking just the one curve. So from negative 90 to 90, just like the sine curve, from negative 90 to 90, so from here to here, that is one-to-one. Because the minute I jump back, if I jump back down to here and go to past 90 and hit here, then this is no longer one-to-one. So for tangent, they chose the interval from negative 90 to 90, just like sine. So that would be negative 90 to 90. Okay, so those are the only intervals we want to worry about, which kind of makes, those two are the only intervals we got to work, which kind of makes it easier, because if I'm trying to find the sine of a ratio, we know that, and if it was a plus minus, we know we'd have to check all four quadrants. Now we're narrowing it down to just two quadrants to look for angles. So for sine, you're only going to have an answer between negative 90 and 90. Cosine, you're going to have an answer between 0 and 90, or 0 and 180, and then tangent, you'd have an answer from negative 90 to 90. So that's one-to-one functions. Solve some of these inverse functions. So I wrote at the top, again, the notation. This means inverse, this means inverse. The -1 does not mean a negative exponent, it means inverse. So these both mean the same thing. You might see them written either way. All right, I'm going to remember my triangles. So I have my 45, 45, 90, so that's 1, 1, radical 2. I have my 30, 60, 90. 30 there. Across from the 30 is the 1, on the hypotenuse is the 2, and across from the 60 is radical 3. Let me see, what else do I want to remember? There's a unit circle, which we'll write down later. I'm going to remember all students take calc. That's where the negative and positives are. And I'm going to remember that sine and tangent are between -90 to 90. And cosine is from 0 to 180 when we talk about inverses. So those are the only quadrants I'm going to worry about. So arc, sine. So I think I got 1/2. So which triangle will give me 1/2? That would be the 30, 60, 90. I remember sine is opposite over hypotenuse. So my brain says, how do I get a 1 in the opposite position? Where would I be standing? So here's the 1. Opposite the 1 is the 30. Hypotenuse is the 2. So that works. So my angle I want to use is 30. Okay, so I'm thinking 30 degrees. All right, now I'm thinking the inverse function has to be in the first or the fourth quadrant. Okay, in the first quadrant, everything's positive. So the ratio would be a positive 1/2. So I know 30 is a good answer. Okay, in the fourth quadrant, is sine positive? No, sine is not positive, cosine is positive. So therefore my fourth quadrant answer is not an answer. So my only answer is going to be 30 degrees. All right, next one, cosine. So again, I'm thinking what uses radical 3? Well, bam, there's a radical 3. I'm thinking cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So where am I going to be standing to get the adjacent to be radical 3? So if I'm standing at the 30, the adjacent side is radical 3, and the 2 is a hypotenuse, so that one works. So again, my brain says I want the 30-degree angle. Then I go back and think, okay, that negative thing there, that's going to play in here. All right, so I know for cosine, I'm in the first and the second quadrant. So if I'm in the first quadrant, that would be the 30 degrees. Is cosine negative in the first quadrant? And my answer is no. So I don't want that 30 degrees. I go to the second quadrant, though. And is cosine negative in the second quadrant? And the answer is yes, because in the second quadrant, sine's the only one that is positive. So that means this guy right here is the 30 degrees, but I don't want it. 30 degree angle is not in the second quadrant. I want the angle that goes from here to here. So I'm going to do 180, take away 30. So my actual angle I want is 150 degrees because that's in the second quadrant. I think about it, it's between 0 and 180. So the inverse, negative radical 3 over 2 is equal to 150 degrees. That would be my answer. Next one I have is arc tangent. Okay, normally we see -1 and we think, oh, that's the unit circle, but it's not the unit circle for tangent. Okay, so for tangent, it is this guy. It's the 45 because tangent is opposite over adjacent. Okay, so that would be this 1 over the 1. So 45 degrees, the opposite would be 1, and the adjacent would be 1. So my brain says I want 45 degrees. All right, and then I'm going to stop and think, well, wait a minute. I need cosine, or tangent is in the first and the second quadrant only. So the inverse is only in the first and the second quadrant because I want between, it's not the second quadrant, sorry, that's cosine. It's between the first and the fourth quadrant because I want between -90 and 90. Okay, so I know it's not in the first because in the first quadrant everything's positive and this guy is negative. So that 45 is going to get crossed off. So I'm down here in 45. Okay, so now in the fourth quadrant, it's 45 degrees is not in the fourth quadrant, and 315, because if I wrapped it all the way around, 315 would not be between 90 and negative 90. So what I want to do is I want to go clockwise instead. If I go clockwise, then that tells me that my answer is negative 45. So negative 45 and 315 are actually the same look to the angle, but I want negative 45 because negative 45 is between 90 and negative 90, which cotangent or arc tangent has to be. All right, so negative 45. Next one, arc sine. So I see radical 2. I know radical 2 has to do with the 45, 45, 90. Okay, my problem is that there's a 2 in the denominator. Well, then I know that this was, prior to this, it was 1 over radical 2, and then I rewrote it the proper way, multiplied by radical 2 over radical 2. So it is a 45-degree angle. So my head says, okay, it's a 45-degree angle. My brain then says, well, I know sine has got to be these two quadrants. Okay, so is 45 a good one? So in the first quadrant, would sine be negative? And we've already talked about it, and no, in the first quadrant, everything is positive, so it's not going to be that one. Okay, the fourth quadrant is sine negative. So in the fourth quadrant, cosine's positive, so yes, sine would be negative in the fourth quadrant. So my answer is in the fourth quadrant. And again, I don't want to write 315, I want to write negative 45 because I need a value between 0 or 90 and negative 90. So that guy would be negative 45. All right, the last one on this sheet here is arc cosine of negative 1. So now this is where I say, okay, this negative 1 is not going to happen in either one of these for cosine. So this negative 1 jumps me back to the unit circle. So I'm going to just draw the coordinate plane here, and I'm going to remember the points are 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. Cosine is my x value, right? All right, so now I look, where is x? Negative 1, and that's over here. X is negative 1 over here, and what angle is that at that point? So right here, that angle would be 180 degrees. Okay, and then I think back, is 180 degrees in my criteria, and I remember that we said that sine is negative from 0 to 180 degrees. So this is 180 degrees, so that one works. And that would be my final answer for that. So that's how you would do coterminal. Not coterminal, that would be how you would do quadrantals. So notice a couple things. All the answers are between either 90 and negative 90 or 0 and 180. There's nothing like 270 or 220. And most of the all these answers have one answer, which will pretty much be most of the time for these problems. All right, so again, make sure you know what the interval you need is. So it's either sine and tangent are negative 90 to 90, cosine is 0 to 180. If you go past those points, you're no longer a one-to-one function, and you can't have an inverse for that. Okay, good luck.